Good morning. It's an honor to be here with all of you today and to have a conversation with this distinguished panel. I'm joined by Commissioner Reitschaffen, Commissioner Thompson, and former Chair Collisar. We are here today to discuss how the pandemic has changed the priorities for each of our respective commissions. Our work has become increasingly important as we act to lessen the socioeconomic toll of the pandemic within our respective states. Our work has become more challenging as many utilities face financial distress. The actions of our state commissions undertake in response to the crisis are typically under the radar, but they do affect millions. The delivery of essential services to the population has never been of such importance. I'd like to begin by giving a brief background on each of our speakers. To begin, I'll start with Commissioner Clifford Reitschaffen. He was appointed to the California Public Utilities Commission by Governor Jerry Brown in January 2017. Prior to joining the CPUC, Commissioner Reitschaffen served as senior advisor to Governor Brown from 2011 to 2017, where he worked on climate, energy, and environmental issues. In 2011, he also served as acting director of the California Department of Conservation. Commissioner Reitschaffen served as Special Assistant Attorney General to the California Attorney General's Office from 2007 to 2010. He is the author of several books and numerous articles on environmental law and policy. He is a graduate of Yale Law School and Princeton University. Next is Commissioner Mark Thompson. He's a commissioner with the Public Utilities Commission of Oregon, where he regulates the state's investor-owned electric, natural gas, water, and telephone utilities. Prior to being appointed to the commission, he was a partner at Sanger Thompson PC. Mark also worked as senior director for the regulatory affairs for the Northwest Natural Gas Company, and prior to that served as staff counsel to the Public Power Council. Mark holds a JD from Lewis and Clark Law School and a Bachelor of Science in Conservation Biology from Brigham Young University. Next, we have former chair Mark Collisar, who has over 30 years of experience in the regulated utility sector. He was a member of the Alberta's Utilities Commission for 12 years, including 6 years as vice chair and 2 years as chair of the commission. Mark also has over 20 years of corporate experience in the telecom sector, where he was vice president of economic affairs at one of Canada's largest telecommunications companies. Mark is now a freelance regulatory consultant with principal expertise in regulatory strategy and performance-based regulation. Mark has an honors degree in philosophy and an MBA in managerial economics and finance. So the COVID-19 pandemic has spread with alarming speed, infecting millions and bringing economic activity to a near standstill as countries impose tight restrictions on movement and halt the spread of the virus. The health and human toll grows, the economic damages is already evident and represents the largest economic shock that the world has ever experienced in decades. The crisis highlights the need for urgent action to cushion the pandemic's health and economic consequences, protect vulnerable populations, and that set the stage for lasting recovery. If not properly addressed through policy, the social crisis created by COVID-19 pandemic may increase inequality, exclusion, discrimination, unemployment in the medium and long term. The socioeconomic challenges presented by COVID have required that the public utilities commissions across the country act quickly to protect the interests of residents. By instituting policies aimed at maintaining delivery of essential utility services during the outbreak, commissions have a critical role in promoting residents' social and financial viability. Dozens of commissions across the country have instituted moratoriums on disconnections and suspended late fees. Today, we have commissioners from California, Oregon, and Alberta online to discuss the response to COVID in their respective states. I'd like to begin with Commissioner Reitschaffen and ask him to speak a little bit about strategies in response to COVID in the state of California.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Commissioner Potter. It's a pleasure to be here, although like many of us, I would have really liked to be there with you in the conference. And among other things, when the conference was postponed, we missed the opportunity to have a signing ceremony to mark the fact that The Hawaii PUC has now joined the PUCs of 5 other Western states, including Commissioner Thompson's Oregon, California, Washington, Nevada, Colorado, in a memorandum of understanding to collaborate on fighting climate change. And we very much look forward to proceeding with these joint efforts. Commissioner Potter outlined some of the serious challenges we've all been dealing with. In California, our immediate focus when the virus hit was to enact a series of consumer protection measures for residential and small business customers. We've seen, as others have, residential usage has increased 10 or 20% since the start of COVID. And of course, millions of people, 4 million people are out of work in California. These included protections like a moratorium on disconnections, a waiver of deposits and fees, and mandatory payment plan options. We also postponed some increases for gas customers in Southern California. We temporarily suspended high usage charges in the top tiers of our rates for customers. We also provided some bill relief by accelerating a program that provides a climate credit for consumers. We accelerated it to be provided earlier in the year. We've also been working to expand our bill payer subsidy programs, which are focused on low-income customers and medically vulnerable customers. Those have increased about 10% in enrollment over the past few months. We've mandated that the utilities engage in additional outreach. We've prevented them from removing people from the programs. We allowed for more self-certification and other measures. We also undertook in the early days some efforts to protect some of the energy, the non-utility energy workforce that was affected by the virus, and in particular, low-income energy efficiency contractors could not get into people's homes to perform services. So we directed the utilities to essentially loan or advance these companies money for 2 months in order to make sure that the workforce did not disappear. So those are some of the steps. I'm sure there's a lot in common with my colleagues in Oregon and Alberta. COVID certainly has impacted utilities in very significant ways. As Commissioner Potter mentioned, they're dealing with both undercollections because of lower sales and just costs that they're not going to be able to collect because of the impacts of the recession. So in California, in the first issue, the lower revenues because of lower sales, we've decoupled revenues from sales. So in that sense, our utilities will be made whole in a true-up proceeding that we have annually that adjusts for lower sales. This is important because the undercollections are going to be very significant, probably several $100 million in California. The second issue of costs that just are not collectible, that have to be written off, our utilities have asked for guarantees that they can recover these costs. We haven't provided it yet, but we will have to be dealing with that issue. And it raises a number of questions. If we do allow for recovery of those costs, how, over what time period? May be easier to postpone them down the road, but that may be a larger hit on the pocketbook later on. Some utilities may want to refinance repayment of those costs through securitization. That requires statutory authorization in California. So those are impacts on consumers, utilities. In terms of the impact on the commission itself, we've gone essentially all virtual. There's some functions that need to be performed, but the vast majority of our 1,200 person workforce is performing virtually. Some people are doing audits and inspections in the field, but otherwise, as with most agencies in California, we are virtual. I feel like we've advanced in some ways 5 years in 2 or 3 weeks in terms of the technology that we employed. Our voting meetings, our formal business meetings are now all virtual. We now allow for the public to comment virtually during them, which actually has increased participation in our meetings. California is a big state. We're headquartered in San Francisco, although we do have meetings 6 or 8 times a year throughout the state, but most of the population is not in San Francisco. It's hard to access for people. So that's been a benefit. We've also had public participation hearings, workshops, pre-hearing conferences are all virtual as well. Again, with benefits. Our Southern California Edison had a public participation hearing last month with 1,500 attendees, 100 speakers. That's way more than usual. We've had webinars in some of our programs with 400 to 500 people participating. I do want to point out, interestingly, we happen to be in the midst of an effort at the Commission to reform our rules of practice and procedure to try to increase transparency, broaden participation among the public. We've been engaged in this for about 2 years. I think we've learned a lot from COVID already. Some of the changes we've had to make on the fly in an emergency basis, we're going to make permanent. Certainly, we're going to have much greater remote participation as a result of this process. I want to take my last couple of minutes just to tee up the issue about what the impacts of COVID will be on clean energy deployment, and in particular, how we can keep advancing our clean energy goals. Obviously, climate change remains as compelling a problem as ever. We're not stopping in terms of our rules. In fact, California just adopted the first in the nation electric truck rule last month. But it's going to be more challenging to meet our objectives. I don't think there's any way around it. And as Commissioner Potter said, COVID has underscored in a dramatic way the economic and social inequalities in our country. These will be seen in greater form as climate change rears its ugly head. Low-income communities, communities of color will be disproportionately affected. So to me, COVID is a clarion call for us to address equity in our programs as we go forward, as of course is the Black Lives Movement and other social movements happening right now. But they're critical questions. Will we have enough money? Can we afford the large-scale investments right now in transportation, electrification, clean energy programs, given the economic impacts of COVID? We were already predicting rate increases from 15 to 35% for our major energy utilities over the next 3 years. Will we be able to sustain that? We rely on cap and trade revenues to fund clean energy programs in California. Our last cap and trade auction yielded a fraction of the regular proceeds because there's less demand, there's less economic activity. So where's the money going to come from? Will it compete with other sources? What will the impact be on consumer demand and spending? Sales of electric vehicles, for example, are quite a bit lower than in previous years, as sales of all cars are. So how do we make sure that we maintain momentum for that? We're seeing a variety of solutions in California being proposed as elsewhere. Some of them are just implementing measures that can be taken without budget impacts by speeding up spending on our programs, reducing permit barriers, streamlining interconnections. And then we're seeing finally just proposals to stimulate the economy through clean energy investments, replace old gas appliances with electric appliances, incentives for that kind of cash for clunker program, labor-intensive projects such as energy efficiency upgrades in low-income units or schools, and proposals to have alternative financing mechanisms. I think that's one of the most interesting things. How do we lower the cost of buying electric vehicles, for example, EV infrastructure? How do we reduce the costs, spread them out over time, or provide loan guarantees to leverage more private funding in a time of government shortfall? So these are some of the challenges. A lot more needs to be written about, and I mean that figuratively, about what we're going to do to try to deal with these COVID problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Wright-Chafin. That is incredibly informative. You have a lot on your plate, and you're certainly tackling this from all angles, and your considerations for the deeper and the broader picture of how our work plays into a larger economy is really critical. And it's great to hear that your commission is tackling this in that regard. I'd like to switch over to Commissioner Thompson. We're running a little short on time, so if you would mind giving us some of, I apologize because of the work that you're doing, and you're renowned for your stakeholder and your engagement and a lot of these issues, and you've been doing that within your response to COVID. So we're excited to hear about the work that you've been doing there. So if you don't mind sharing with us for 5 minutes or so, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks, Commissioner Potter. Yeah, aloha, everybody. Happy to be here with you, and also wish that I could be there in person, but thanks for this chance. I will try to speed up my remarks. There's a lot things that I wanted to say that have already been said by Commissioner Wright-Chafin, as well as Scott Seu in his opening comments that I touched some of. So I want to give you just a quick overview of what we're doing in your neighboring state of Oregon, and then just offer a few thoughts as a relatively new commissioner. Most of my term has been during the pandemic. But first off, I think it probably warrants again just to give a broad statement of the context within which we're operating right now. Obviously, everyone was surprised by the pandemic and the broad, far-reaching impacts that it's had on customers and the companies that they were related. But I think it's worth noting that we're also in the midst of other really important events in society, specifically the clarity with which and the emphasis with which we've heard calls for change and looking at social and racial justice. I bring up that topic not just because it's on all of our minds, but because I truly think that that is broadening the scope of the Oregon PUC's efforts to respond to the pandemic. In other words, we're looking at a regulatory model not only to figure out how to respond to the pandemic, but to see if we can be responsive to some of the social equity issues that have been highlighted in recent months. So in terms of our actions, as soon as the pandemic hit, most of our energy utilities, or all of them, voluntarily came to the Oregon PUC and actually asked for changes to their tariffs that would allow them to suspend charging late fees and that would allow them to institute a disconnect moratorium. They also asked for changes to make it easier for customers that rely on utility service for medical reasons to gain protection, and also to make it easier for customers to participate in low-income programs if they qualify. So we acted on those things very quickly, but to date, that's the only official action that the Oregon PUC has taken. So in some sense, you could say that we've been a very hands-off commission, but I would say that that's not true, that would be misleading. What we've really done to date is to try to institute a process that would be more efficient and more inclusive than what our formal processes have allowed for in the past. So we have collected an internal agency work group with really broad representation. I, as a commissioner, am one of the sponsors of that, which is an unusual role for a commissioner to play in Oregon, but I've been involved. And then that group has reached out to external stakeholders. And whereas we used to usually have about 3 to 5 participants in our formal proceedings, we've invited over 70 different organizations to participate in this, including Native American tribes, communities of color, and representatives, the utilities, environmental justice organizations, and other customers, groups of other customers that haven't historically participated. So the goal has been to really run a process that allows the commission to look holistically at these issues as opposed to in a piecemeal manner, trying to allow for creativity and collaboration and see if some consensus can be forged about the way forward, and yet do this in a quick enough time frame that we can really be responsive to the needs that we know are out there. So to date, we've had a public meeting, we've had several workshops with this group, and I will say that the scope of work is that everything's on the table. We've compiled a list of at least 20 different ideas that are meant to bring relief, and the stakeholder group is sort of talking about those right now and seeing what they can agree to, and then in September, we'll have our staff bring us proposals, and we'll act either on some of the low-hanging fruit or potentially in a more sweeping manner to try to address the pandemic and the equity issues that have been raised. I will just wrap up by saying, as a new commissioner, a couple of feelings that I've had. One is been terrified, and number 2 is I felt like this is some of the most meaningful work I'm meant to get to do in my career. I think it's probably worth saying it's terrifying because the issues are important and the need is great. The points of view that are being expressed are extremely diverse, and the way forward is not clear. But it's also really meaningful because it's a chance to do good for all parties involved and to try to bring relief to a situation that's really serious. So I will wrap up in the interest of time and leave it there, but happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. That was really informative. I appreciate that. I'm going to turn to former chair, Collisar. If you can provide us with some brief comments, I apologize, but we're running slow on time here. Some comments about the work that you've done in Alberta and your perspective on how we get to recovery. That'd be wonderful.
Okay, just make sure that you can hear me.
Yep,
Good
sounds
enough.
good.
Just by way of context, there's probably a lot of people on this webinar who don't understand what the Alberta regime looks like. It is a very complex market and a very complex regulatory regime. So probably the regime that would be most like it is Texas. So if you think about how complicated the regime is there, ours is very much like that. We have a competitive energy only market. We have a competitive retail market. We have both distribution and transmission, separate utilities. Distribution is regulated under performance-based regulation, distribution under a more traditional rate-based rate of return approach, and we have an independent system operator that manages the transmission, but is also the entity that manages the energy-only market. So it's a very complex regime, and that led to some real complications about how we might provide support, because the utilities are very disaggregated. Just a bit of background on what the impact is here, or was here. In addition to the implications of the pandemic, we as a province were also faced with unusually low oil prices, which had a huge economic impact. So when you combine all those things, what you had was a decline in demand at the same time that the supply side was actually going up, because 2 wind farms and 1 significant solar farm came on just as the pandemic hit. What we saw was load drop by the end of May by about 6.5% compared to the year before. Interestingly, we saw a shift in the time of when load actually ramped up. Ordinarily, it ramps up between about 6 and 9 a.m., but the ramp up actually started to hit later, about 1 hour later than it ordinarily would. The other thing too is the daily peak, which generally happens at around 6 p.m., was not as large as it used to be, largely because I think there was a 10% reduction in industrial load, and it brought that entire peak down. With respect to how the commission here responded, there was a 90-day bill payment deferral put into place, backstopped by the provincial government, and that was available to any customer that used less than 250,000 kilowatt hours per year, and any gas customer that used less than 2,500 gigajoules of gas, and that's 23,700 US thermal units. So they were basically able to avail themselves of a 90-day deferral. Now, it didn't mean they didn't have to pay it. They just didn't have to pay it for 3 months between March 18th and June 18th. And as you might expect, I won't go through all of the details of implementation, but given the disaggregated nature of the Alberta utility sector, implementing this was particularly complicated because there's a lot of flows that happen between retail, distribution, transmission. And if roughly 30% of customers just in those rate groups had availed themselves of the 90-day billing deferral, we would have been taking about $300 million out of those money flows. So what actually happened, though, was there was much less uptake than what we actually thought there would be. And I think that's largely because the utilities themselves had an incentive to support their own customers and to provide opportunities for them to change the way that they actually paid their bills. It became pretty clear to us that the utilities really do have an incentive to keep as many customers on as they can and to try to support them. And I think a lot of that uptake really was a result of the utilities themselves stepping up to make sure that they provided as much support to their customers as they could. On the large commercial and industrial side, there was at its peak quite a bit of concern about the lack of short-term rate relief. And most of that basically centered around concerns about what demand charge ratchets look like. So if you take, for an example, a major hotel chain, if nobody's staying at the hotel and they still have to pay their demand ratchet, even though they're not actually drawing much because nobody's there, that could prove to be a significant portion of the bill that they have to pay, that they have no revenue that they can offset. So trying to figure out how to deal with the demand charge ratchets sort of became a big concern at the time. That concern was never really resolved because I think happily we started seeing some reopening of the market here post-pandemic in June, and quite a bit of the market here is now actually back. So I think a lot of that pressure is now off. Long term, there's obviously going to be a significant revenue shortfall for a lot of the utilities here. I don't currently have a read at how big that is, but it's certainly an issue that any regulator is going to have to ultimately deal with. And I think it's a pretty complex issue because there are a lot of potential implications here. So whereas we've seen a reduction in demand and a reduction in the revenues, we've probably also seen a significant reduction in the costs that may have been incurred. And as a result of that, there's a lot of puts and takes, and I think any regulator has to really think about that. There's questions as to what happens to the weighted average cost of capital as a result of this. There's also questions about what's the best tool, the best mechanisms to use to make the utilities whole, and how whole should they be made? Like, do you recover it all, or do you only recover some reasonable amount of what that shortfall is? There's obviously way too many issues for us to chew on in the time we have. And I think it's probably time for me to wrap up and toss it back over to you, Jenny.
Thank you. I have a feeling we could continue on for several hours, actually, and I appreciate all of your perspectives. It's actually really interesting to hear about sort of the framework of our regulatory regimes that are, being challenged and pushed to the brink here. And Mark Thompson, I appreciate your comments on this being rather terrifying. That the honesty of really what kind of hats we have to wear and the decisions and the impacts that we make, as commissioners is really intense, and it's heavy. It's a big heavy load. And so I commend all of you for taking such a leadership role and the charge on this. Each of you are definitely at the forefront of recommendations to participate in this panel for the work that you are doing. And unfortunately, we don't have time to answer audience questions. We have to pitch it back over so the conference may go on. But I can't thank all of you enough for agreeing to be here and share your experiences with us here in Hawaii and with folks that are watching from around the country. So thank you very much for your time.
Mahalo to the panel for sharing their mana'o with us, their perspectives, and special shakas for Commissioner Collisar, who wore his aloha shirt today for this occasion. Awesome. Next up is a short video from the Hawaiian Clean Power Alliance, followed by a break.
Thank you all for taking the time to participate in the Hawaii Energy Conference's first virtual conference. I must admit, I would have preferred an in-person conference, but given the current times, it's great that the conference was able to pivot to this platform. The Hawaii Clean Power Alliance is a nonprofit organized to advance development of utility-scale clean energy in Hawaii. We strive to educate the public and support the state's clean energy goals while doing so in a responsible and equitable manner. We are governed by a board of directors, and our members include developers, owners, and operators of utility-scale clean energy projects. Hawaii Clean Power Alliance champions opportunities for independent power producers in Hawaii. We provide a single voice for the industry that networks and dialogues with different stakeholders, making sure our members' voices are heard and their interests in renewable energy development are shared. HTPA is present in the PUC proceedings and advocates for policies that help advance renewable energy development in Hawaii. Become a member now and let HTPA help with the challenges that you are facing while also working with the community to find healthy alignment. In addition to advocating for independent power producers, we have embarked on a mission to better understand how to advance clean energy. We've conducted an initial framing study to identify macroeconomic impacts associated with the investment and policy changes that are shaping our future. Decision makers need a complete understanding of the implications of their decisions on the economy and residents' well-being. A comprehensive analytical tool, especially in a post-COVID budget-constrained scenario, is key to identifying the optimal set of programs to achieve the state's decarbonization and environmental policy goals. Why this work matters? First, there is a need for access to clean and low-cost energy. Second, budgets are constrained and we must make choices as individuals, as companies, and as a government that makes sense. Third, there is a risk for severe disruptions if ill-informed decisions are made that result in a lack of resiliency and a lost opportunity for sustainable change. Lastly, there's an opportunity to expand access for all and avoid repeating past inequities that are so obvious now. Our next step is to secure funding to expand our study and begin publishing our findings. If you'd like to become a member, check the membership information and application brochure in the conference's digital swag bag or send us an email. Hawaii Clean Power Alliance is always checking the pulse of the community, and we'd love to hear more from you and get your input as we continue to develop our macroeconomic work. We would like to acknowledge and thank the State of Hawaii and the Hawaii Technology Development Corporation for their support in our work. Thanks for being part of the first virtual Hawaii Energy Conference. You can also find us on all the major social media outlets, including Instagram, where you'll find some of my best pictures of this beautiful state.